the first week, basically, we started off with kind of like taking a look at like, okay, what culture shifts for like a more humane long-term culture can come from this crisis. And this was more kind of like to set like, let's say more like a mental container for then diving into specific specific action items. Second week was all about high impact science and technology development, and we had really fantastic panels with really quite concrete action items flowing from that. And then now this week we're kind of like zooming out and discussing, well, given the fact that suddenly all eyes are on on global resilience and actually cooperative institutions, which is something that I think many in this community have worried about and worked at quite concretely for years and years, given that we're now in the spotlight, in the sense that, you know, things have to work now, and there's definitely kind of like a lot of vacuum that's shown, and things that are not quite working well, but also a lot of opportunity to kind of like make things run smoothly. How can we actually create a global container that is much more resilient from this crisis? How can we avoid just kind of like solving for the next pandemic, but can we actually do something that's a little bit better than that? So I think now is a really good time to think about this, because the kind of the window of opportunity in which we have time to act is probably quite short. I am personally in a little bit of a predicament having this fantastic panel here, because I think, you know, every one of you I would love to have on just to talk about the projects that you are working on, in fact, on a day-to-day basis. And today, you know, we're actually trying to do something that's a little bit more meta level in the sense of like you as kind of like the organizers and the kind of the coordination points in your community. You know, how have you found that those communities that you're spearheading or at least kind of like elevating, how have you found them responding to the crisis, and how can we use it as role models to do better? But I definitely want kind of like your immediate work to inform this conversation. So I think maybe we just dive right into it, right? So first, I would love to discuss today, like, why do we even want more decentralized and kind of like agile communities, right? Why are they even a good thing if they are? What are they good for? What aren't they good for? And I think, you know, having that kind of like tied to concrete, to your concrete work would be my ideal outcome. So perhaps we can start with you, Zarinah. Like, Zarinah, you're not only like a very dear friend, bunkmate, and for the best of our times, and really, really close human to me, but you're also this incredible nexus of communities, which is, you know, starting from the Embassy Network, which is the network that we're both part of and live in, but also, you know, spearheading efforts like the Second Life community, spearheading efforts like alternative justices, spearheading now a new effort of Beyond Return, where we already had Eric on in the first week. So you're really kind of like at the intersection of many of those amazing communities. So I'd love to hear from you. How many communities are you a part of? What do you think is their value? And kind of like, what are you currently focusing on? What are you giving most of your attention to right now?
Myself. Hi, so nice to see everybody here and to be part of this conversation. So my name's Zarinah, and as Allison mentioned, I'm part of a number of different communities. I think probably the ones that might be of interest here are the Embassy Network or District Commons, which is a sort of collective, an international collective of intentional communities around the world, Hate Street Commons, various sort of like solidarity-based communities. And I think what's interesting about these spaces is they are sort of place-based sort of social incubators, if you like, where you embed yourself in this space, and together you create a completely different culture. So it's like known as a transfer culture, right? These are the processes, the ideas, the governance structures, the decision-making tools, the financial tools that you need to start right now to get yourself from the current world order to a new one. And for any of us that have been in those spaces, we've all experienced that deeply, and realized that not only are you sort of testing out new processes, but you are being changed in the process so that you are someone who is ready for a different kind of social logic.
Very nice. All right. Yeah, I'm hoping we can talk a little bit more about specifics in a second. Glen, if I can move on to you. I'm very, very honored that you're joining us. It's really, really nice to see you, at least virtually. I know that you have a ton of things going on. I think RadicalXChange is doing its own conference coming up very soon. And, you know, I think like Radical Markets is definitely one of the books that I've seen on most bookshelves these days, really, in most of the back in the days when we could still visit each other. That said, I've seen that book in many of the bookshelves. It's really a fantastic, I think, a fantastic expose. Then Vitalik actually did an incredible podcast with Rob Wiblin from ADK on many of the ideas of RadicalXChange, which was really good for, I think, a lot of the effective altruism community to be exposed to those ideas. So I would just love to hear from you, how have you set up this incredible movement from that book? How was that, and what are your current focus?
So thanks so much for having me. It's really great to get introduced to this community, which I wasn't as familiar with before, and to interact with you all. Really, my life has three interrelated but very different chunks. I have the RadicalXChange movement, which now has about 100 local groups around the world, building around ways that we can sort of move forward our political economy in the types of radical innovation directions that technology has taken forward, how we communicate with each other. And I am at Microsoft advising the senior leaders on geopolitics, macroeconomics, and the future of technology. And most recently, for the last 2 months, almost full time, I've been the co-chair of the Harvard Edmund J. Safra Center for Ethics Rapid Response Group on COVID, which through a variety of circumstances has ended up becoming a central point of coordination for a lot of both American and to some extent global efforts to address the crisis. So I'm really seeing it from three different intersecting point of view, one of the largest companies in the world, this social movement, and sort of an attempt to address the crisis systemically. And there's a lot to be said from each of those perspectives. I think the shortest version of it is that, I think we've all been incredibly inspired by the way in which lots of people have come together, and also incredibly disappointed by the way in which many of our institutions and many seats of power have failed to take on the responsibility that their positions of power have given them. And I think we're in for a moment of really systemic rethinking of our institutions, given that. That's something that RadicalXChange had sort of been building towards, expecting that moment would come at some point. I'm really worried we didn't make enough progress before we hit that. And I hope that things emerge in a liberal democratic direction of some general form out of that. But I'm looking forward to talking to you more about all those questions.
Yeah, for sure. I think, on the one hand, you've really seen like communities rise to the challenge, but on the other hand, whenever they could, authoritarian regimes were kind of like basically every little loophole that was open, they were immediately tempering in. And I think, that what better segue into introducing Alex Gladstein. Alex is part of the Human Rights Foundation, and he has not only written the little book on Bitcoin recently, and given, I think yesterday, a talk at the Bitcoin halving celebration, but you also recently did a fantastic Human Rights Foundation event, COVIDCon, and it was all about authoritarian regimes and how they may be abusing, propagating, and then abusing COVID-19 to kind of like extend their reach in ways that were impossible before. So Alex, I'm really, really happy to have you here. I think I have to unmute you, but if you just quickly want to introduce yourself and kind of like elaborate on your perspective on it. And by the way, I posted the recent Harvard report that I think Glen was contributing to in the chat if people want to check it out. Okay, Alex, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. Always a fun opportunity to talk to this incredible community. Yeah, so my communities are really two. The first one I've been working on since 2007 with the Human Rights Foundation, which is a nonprofit based in New York that helps people who live under authoritarian regimes around the world. Just briefly, that's about, according to our data, about 4.3 billion people in 95 countries. About 53% of the world's population lives under a government that doesn't permit free assembly, free speech, free and fair elections. It doesn't have an independent judiciary. You can't really build a nonprofit, things like that. So whereas in America, for example, we can donate to the EFF or the ACLU, and we can sue our government and write op-eds in the New York Times or Wall Street Journal, or even make a living making fun of the president. You can't do that in Cameroon or Vietnam or Russia or Saudi Arabia or so many other countries. So HRF's mission is to figure out ways to help people who live under a different architecture. It doesn't mean that democracies can't do bad things. They do a lot of bad things. But what we do is we focus on the fact that inside democracies and open societies, there are resources for people who want to change policy and change the government. These don't exist inside dictatorships and authoritarian regimes. So that's our focus. And the community we've built is called the Oslo Freedom Forum, which is our annual gathering of people who come to tell stories about their lives in these countries. And then we kind of pair them with leaders from technology and philanthropy and policy and media and other fields who sit in the audience and listen to them. And then we have interactive programming where folks can build off of each other. And it's a nice dual effect because it ends up helping support human rights in authoritarian places, which is really important because almost virtually all of the money that gets donated in the world to human rights, which is a lot, goes to open societies. So, and that's just sort of because where the power structure is, but people want to help their own societies and their own neighborhoods. And I understand that. But what that ends up meaning is that most of the human rights funding comes from Europe and the United States and stays there. You know, it doesn't go to Cameroon, for example, right? So the Oslo Freedom Forum does is try to disrupt that a little bit by introducing a lot of the larger charities and influential folks to stories they may not have heard before. So that network's been growing, and we launched a one-off event called COVIDCon to hear from them about what's happening around the world in authoritarian countries with regard to how governments are exploiting the opportunity of COVID, to do emergency power grabs and install crazy surveillance systems. And, a lot of people are like, oh, it's overblown. Well, in Europe, the leader, quote unquote, of Hungary has actually used COVID as an opportunity to start ruling by decree, which is the dictionary definition of a dictatorship. So you now have 10 million people in the EU who are living under a dictator as a result of a government overreaction to this virus. So I think that the timing is very important for this conversation, and happy to share some lessons from that, the sort of global democracy movement. The second community that I am proudly a part of is the Bitcoin community. And as you mentioned, we have a very special day today. So in about an hour and 10 minutes or so, we'll have to see. We got 7 blocks left. There's going to be something called the halving, which is part of Bitcoin's independent monetary policy, which I think is really interesting to think about today, because one of the ways governments are reacting to the economic depression caused by their imposed lockdowns is by printing historic sums of money and acquiring different kinds of assets from the private sector. And we've never seen anything like this before, so we don't know what's going to happen. But it is interesting that there's this other experiment with a monetary system that doesn't have that ability to just print more money. And we're going to have these two systems, the fiat system and the Bitcoin system, running side by side for the next, many decades. And we're going to have to see how it goes. But the Bitcoin community is very interested in like localism and independence, just because of a general skepticism of failures of global institutions. So I think those are the two communities I'm happy to talk more about here.
Awesome. Okay. And this is definitely already for everyone participating a call to action. If you want to hear more about individual cases, just preface it with a Q. Basically, you leave a comment in the chat or on Slack with a Q, and then we're going to get to those at the end of it. Also, let's dive into the first questions here. And we're going to first hear from the panelists, but please also everyone answer them either here in the chat or on Slack. The first question is, how have the decentralized communities versus default institutions performed in the current crisis? So please, answer away in the chat if you're interested. I want to hear specifically from the panel, kind of like, what do you think are the major strengths and weaknesses that specifically became apparent in the crisis? And do you think that there is any specific opportunities in how, on the one hand, decentralized communities could emerge stronger out of this, but also on the other hand, for how institutions could either be outcompeted or reformed, that are emerging right now with COVID-19. Zarinah, do you want to take a first go at it? I'm going to unmute you.
Great. I think, the intentional communities or the intentional community commons has reacted in a myriad of ways. It's been very interesting to watch. For the most part, I think the strength that this sort of like quite large collective has is that it is very diverse. And so it has a diverse set of processes and structures and agreements. And what that means is that when unexpected challenges come, these communities can be more than just resilient. They can be anti-fragile. They often learn very quickly and become stronger as a consequence of knocks. And I think what's difficult in the sort of like mainstream world is that there are dominant systems that are like not very flexible. And so you can see our economy's really struggled. Empty planes have carried on flying, and all these like very strange sort of things have started to happen as a consequence of this expected, unexpected global phenomenon. But I think what happens in decentralized communities or in these intentional communities is that there's tons of different ways, different economic logics and social logics at play. And so the sort of ecosystem is well positioned to adapt to these sort of really unexpected challenges. In practice, what does this look like? I think there is a culture that allowed an early adoption of shelter in place. So for whatever reason, many of these communities were really ahead of the curve. Most of the communities I know of were in shelter in place well before city ordinance, which meant that people haven't been getting very sick. There's very strong sort of social ecology there, so learning spread very fast. So documentation was shared, resources were shared. We had sort of like equipment teams formed to go and sort of deliver medical equipment to those who couldn't get out. There was food delivery teams. There's, you know, pay what you can, grocery co-ops sort of like spontaneously forming left, right, and center. And you can just sort of see humans emerging in a sort of adaptable and resilient way that I sort of really wish everyone could have. There's almost no one who hasn't got their needs met. There's sort of solidarity funds looking after people who can't afford to pay their rent. There's landlords teaming up with tenants to try and make sure that they get support from the banks. Whereas out in the sort of rest of the world, it really seems like it's become every person for themselves, and that's really tough because a lot of people are going to lose in that game. So I think that's been one way that these communities have done well. The other is, you know, we are not alone. Like a lot of people are sort of physically distancing alone, and the communities are physically distancing together. And I think we're going to see that social isolation, which was already a terrible problem for the world, is going to be culturally traumatic in the next sort of 6 months, a couple of years. I think we'll see that play out. So there's a lot of sort of resilience there. Not to say that it hasn't been hard. There's been a lot of problems. So these often what you find in sort of prefigurative politics and prefigurative projects is, you know, a leaning towards democratic and sort of consensual decision making, or duocratic decision making, right? And these communities are not built for fast decisions. They don't have an emergency plug. They don't have a trigger button. And so watching these communities that are built on extremely high confidence and high trust relationships try and act very fast was quite difficult. But I think that's okay because, you know, ultimately we've got bigger emergencies that we are facing in our lifetimes that we have to figure out how to solve. So I think we need to learn and level up, you know.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, it is almost traumatizing just to be away from you, I think, you know, because it feels weird to be isolating away from you. But yeah, definitely, I think the points well taken on isolating together is definitely... yeah, I don't know where it'd be without it. But I think one thing that you said about how can we have communities that are decentralized and kind of like participatory, yet can be like good crisis responders, you know, that, you know, there is definitely kind of like some trade-offs there to be made. And I would be super curious, Glen, like, you know, how the RadicalXChange, I think, community has stepped up to this, because you have, I mean, with so many global nodes, that must have been quite the coordination game there, no?
Well, so Allison, I wish that I could tell you a lot of stories from what RadicalXChange has been doing, but the reality is I've gotten so immersed in the COVID response that actually the stories I have more to tell you about are the Harvard effort, but also some of the efforts around the world that have succeeded. And I really resonated with what Zarinah was talking about on the ground from the perspective that I'm looking at it, because and I think someone just posted this in the chat. I wrote a piece for Foreign Affairs about the enormous success that the Taiwanese government had in responding. It's really been the most successful government in the world. And what is remarkable about it is the way that it simultaneously leveraged a lot of this on-the-ground community participation, but then extremely rapidly scaled the successes there using various kinds of digital participatory democracy decision-making tools. And I think that that really is the challenge confronting us, is how can we have, as Zarinah put it, these responsive participatory institutions, but subject to clear timelines, decision-making criteria, et cetera. And I think that there are tools for that. I think, things like quadratic voting, things like the very cool system of wiki surveys that poll.is has one good product around. Things like the some of the other deliberative tools and consensus forming tools that Audrey Tang in Taiwan has really leveraged. I actually do truly believe that thoughtfully designed multi-level participatory democracy institutions are the most efficient and effective ways of making these decisions. However, it's very important that we keep in mind that ultimately the legitimacy of these institutions in a crisis like this depends on their ability to rapidly respond and implement the measures that are needed to assure the safety and ability of the rest of society to operate in that decentralized way. And the reality is that there are only a small number of liberal democracies that allowed that to occur. That occurred in the East Asian and Australasian democracies. It really failed in most of the Western European democracies. And it spectacularly failed in the United States. And through the Harvard process, I really saw the way in which, quote, decentralized, unquote, institutions can quickly become an excuse for everyone pointing the finger at someone else. And decision-making authority on critical public good provision lying with no one. And I think that's really what happened in the US and in much of Western Europe. And I think, frankly, as a result of that, we are going to end up getting the worst of both worlds. We are going to lose most of the lives that were there to be lost, and we're going to have put the economy into the worst depression perhaps ever documented. So it's very important to understand that if we want to succeed in supporting these values, we need to learn from the Taiwans, the Australias, the South Koreas about how to make the values that we have useful tools, because they are, for achieving that kind of awareness, intelligence, coordination, and action, and not impediments as we've often allowed them to become to that sort of action. Yeah, I'm looking forward to more discussion about that, but that's really what I think Zarinah highlighted as the key issue if we want to have success. I think we're going to go through a systemic crisis of liberal democracy, and we need to show the ways in which technology and new developments can allow it to come out stronger rather than to die.
Well, thanks. I think before we switch to Alex and open up a new thread, I would actually love to maybe tag on it a little bit. Like, do you have any specific proposals in which we could show that, are there specific efforts that you think we ought to be highlighting or ought to be more engaged in right now, if we actually want to make the case that that there is something that can be done instead of either totally flip-flopping or having an autocratic lockdown.
Yes. Zarinah, did you want to speak to that?
I was just going to say, I think something that's really missing from our sort of flip-flopping or our binary ideas of lockdown or not is what would sort of actually a safe easing look like. And I think we just don't, for some reason, we don't have the tools. So in England, there was a call out for volunteers to support their National Health Service. And on their first day that they put this call out, they got like 6 times the number of volunteers that they needed to keep the National Health Service going. It's extraordinary. So, people who are at home sheltering in place aren't just sort of being lazy. They're like eager to help. And so there's tons of effort, participation, and sort of potential out there. We just don't have the means for reorienting it. And I think, I don't know if anyone's heard of Mondragon. It's in Spain, the world's biggest worker-owned cooperative, and it's enormous. And they put a lot of their success down. They've like gone through the recession being largely unaffected, and they put a lot of their success down to the fact that they are able to move their workers around. If something goes wrong over here, they all sort of get together because it's worker-owned. They decide together. They shut down this business or half their wages, and everybody half their wages, and they sort of just have a much more fluid approach. And I think that's something that's really missing in our society. We just don't have workers that we can be like, hey, can you stop doing this and start doing that? Because everything's a sort of private corporation,
I'm going to unmute Alex and Glenn, so you can both chip in.
Yeah, so I just want to talk about 2 examples briefly. I'll build on what Glenn said about Taiwan, but also I want to mention Hong Kong. These are 2 societies that have very different structures, but have performed incredibly well against COVID. Hong Kong has a population of 7.5 million and has had 4 deaths. Taiwan has a population of 24 million and has had 7 deaths, and they're both top 20 in the world in terms of population density. With regard to Hong Kong, I interviewed Joshua Wong, the very prominent democracy protest leader there recently. And I asked him, how is this possible? I mean, you have such an incompetent authoritarian government that's currently occupying itself with police brutality. Like, how are they doing so well? And he said, no, it's not Carrie Lam's government. It's the people of Hong Kong. It's a decentralized response. He told me that people had already prepared themselves mentally for this sort of thing via SARS, and they all owned masks. So if you look at the data from February 1 on, 98% of Hong Kongers have been wearing masks out in public. 80% of them have been social distancing. This is all an incredibly decentralized, citizen-led response that they're very proud of. And they were the ones pushing Carrie Lam, who didn't want to close the border to China in January. If you actually go back and read it, Joshua Wong was out there saying, hey, you should close this border. This is going to be bad for us. She wouldn't do it because Beijing wouldn't let her. So one model that we can look at is like a decentralized citizen response, which is really interesting. Building on what Glenn said in Taiwan, obviously, I'd probably say that the best response from any nation. I agree. One thing I would want to caution, though, is that even the Taiwanese, much like the Norwegians, who are, some of the freest countries in the world, have been experimenting a little bit with big data in a way that I think is really concerning. So I'll just share a quick story. In Taiwan on February 5th, a ship docked in Taiwan called the Diamond Princess. It was a cruise ship coming from Japan, going elsewhere. So the Taiwanese authorities preemptively and without permission from the citizens, they have a special act called the Infectious Diseases Act, which allows them to violate the civil liberties of their citizens without informing them, which I think should be overturned and debated seriously. The good news is Taiwan's an open society where they are debating these things. But what ended up happening is that the vice president of the legislative yuan and a bunch of other technologists and academics, have studied the government's response to the Diamond Princess. So essentially what the government did was unilaterally spy on about 620,000 people who could have conceivably come into contact with anyone who came off that ship. They used a mixture of public health data, credit card transaction data, geolocation data from phones, as well as transit data. And the crazy part was, I thought that this is a study that I can send the link shortly, but they spied on all these people and stripped them of their liberties and rights, and they didn't find a single person who was positive. So it was a very interesting experiment, and the paper somehow tries to justify it, but really it just shows you the limits of like the idea that technology can save us. And what's good is that the Taiwanese people are pushing back, and they're going to have like a robust debate about this. And very well, hopefully there won't be mass surveillance in Taiwan moving forward. Other countries aren't so lucky. I mean, it's not like the Chinese citizens can push back against their government because they're forcing them to be color-coded. It's not something, they don't have a mechanism for that. So generally speaking, we saw a decentralized response that was really effective in Hong Kong, despite the government. And then we saw, like, again, a centralized response in Taiwan that's been exemplary, but has had some, even they've had some concerning issues. So these are just two things I would want to draw folks' attention to.
So one thing I would highlight about the Taiwanese experience on the more positive side of the way in which, I don't really like the term decentralization or centralization, really I'd say multi-level, interactive governance, is the number of things that came up through the really participatory democracy platform, citizen-led digital engagement initiatives that then became central to the government's response, whether it was the allocation of masks, some of the approaches to that Diamond Princess data that more went through citizen sharing information rather than purely top-down, that all played a really important role in the success in Taiwan. So I think it is absolutely critical that we safeguard our values and that we show the ways in which those values, like in the Hong Kong example that you just discussed, Alex, serve to actually get us to that efficacious response. Because the reality is every single country that managed to avoid the worst of this did it through some form of testing, tracing, and supported isolation type program. And the question is, can we show that the values of pluralistic governance can actually serve to get us quickly to that point, rather than just be ways of, quote, slowing things down? And I think if we don't show that, frankly, those values are going to fall by the wayside in the aftermath of this, because the reality is that people are going to be facing such extreme circumstances that they're going to look to anyone who can tell a narrative about how it is that we avoid those cases. And if we don't have a strong narrative about the role of pluralism in making that all work, we're going to be on the losing side.
Can you already perhaps kind of like foreshadow what kind of like such a narrative could look like? And also specifically, are there any, let's say, like technical coordination tools that you've seen popping up that may facilitate like a more, let's say, agile response in the future?
Well, look, I mean, for years, I have been advocating the sorts of interesting ideas that lie underneath things like this Bluetooth-based peer warning approaches, et cetera. Unfortunately, those were rolled out at the last moment without any preparation by a couple of tech companies, without a lot of social engagement and community grounding. And I'm not sure that they're going to have much success in that context. I wish that we had laid the groundwork many years ago for structures of data that could allow for that kind of non-top-down, peer-based information sharing. And I think if we had had those, and we had had sort of people getting used to the ways in which those can be used and not and so forth, we would have had a very effective response to the present moment ready to go. And I think that the tools in Taiwan and the democratic systems that were already built there played a critical role, as I mentioned, in the response. And I think that we need to tell a story about how that was even much better than what happened within China, rather than allowing the story to be China versus the liberal democracies. So I think that is, the way I see it, is it's really, China didn't do such a great job, actually. Taiwan did much better. Hong Kong did much better. The East Asian liberal democracies did much better because they had this fusion of technology and decentralization, democratic values, and that's what we need the world to understand. And of course, they didn't do it perfectly, as Alex pointed out, and there were issues there. But those are the systems we need to start building. We need to tell that positive story as soon as possible.
Glenn, what's your feedback on that? Sorry, just what's your feedback on the Japan model? I'd love to hear what you have to say, given they're taking a different tack and seem to be successful.
Could you tell me more about that, Alex? I haven't followed it closely enough.
Well, they didn't have a major economic lockdown. they, from what we understand, didn't do as much intense pilfering of people's data like the South Koreans and the Taiwanese did. And yet they have more than 100 million people and only 600 deaths. So people are trying to like figure out what happened in Japan. But I guess it's another option. It's another model to look at as a way where a democratic government seems to have done very well, you know, without necessarily kind of like violating civil liberties. I'm of the belief that we can sort of figure this thing out and fight this thing in a way that reflects our values of innovation, you know, open societies, things like that. I'm pretty sure it works out.
Tracing, is that true, Alex?
It looks like they did intense traditional contact tracing of clusters, which is of course really important, but it doesn't appear that they've been doing mass surveillance on people's phones, which is kind of where I draw the line. But yeah, it looks like they've done very well in that regard. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to share I think it was maybe last week, Thursday, salon on contact tracing, where we quickly touched on that model as well. If people are interested in checking up on the technical details, I would love to know maybe, you know, from the thread that Glenn already started, and then we're going to move into participant questions. So please, people, start collecting questions now, mark them with a Q in the chat, so I can unmute you to ask the panelists. But, you know, I think Glenn was already mentioning this, right? Like we need a good narrative kind of like moving forward, because otherwise the narrative will be claimed, but also perhaps pointing to specific tools in which people can coordinate better in better ways on those multi-levels. So do you have any kind of like specific like beacons of hope in that regard? Like how can we do better? What story can we tell so that, like, okay, basically in the last meeting on aging, we had the same thing that Glenn mentioned, right? If only we had focused on like aging efforts a little earlier, we wouldn't be kind of like in this pandemic in the first place with the big effects that it had, because people wouldn't be so prone to the virus. But now that we didn't do that, how can we do it better for the next one, right? Like, there's still something to be said now to kind of put the systems in place that at least we can be better prepared for future ones. So are there specific threads that you think are now promising to follow up?
Everyone? Yeah. I think, you know, something to be aware of is that, you know, this is sort of mostly preventable problem, right? And obviously we've seen this like extraordinary experiment play out where different countries that have different like morbidities in their populations and different social structures and different access to healthcare have all played out really differently. And it's been a sort of like horrifying and mesmerizing social experiment to watch the death rates be so high in some places and so extraordinarily low in others. So this is really like to suggest that this is something that could have been humanly shaped or has been humanly shaped. And I think this, like many other crises that we're going to face as a planet, is you know, has made our sort of socioeconomic disparities really, really clear. So the race divide in people dying or affected by this is extraordinary, and so is that of socioeconomic class. I think a lot of the war that we're seeing about the fight to go back to work is about a fight to be able to pay your rent. People aren't actually attached to their jobs. You know, they just they want to be able to survive. And for many of us, we can just put our lives on hold. We can work from home, do all these sort of things to keep ourselves safe. But for an extraordinary amount of the population, that's just not possible. So I think going forward to do better, I think our narrative has to be like, yes, we're all in this together, but we have not been in this together equally, and we must be more equal going forward. You know, the humans are an extremely social species, and we need to sort of make sure that we all make it.
Yeah,
right, Glenn. Oh, sorry, Alex, chime in. And Glenn,
I just was going to build on that. That's a great point. It's all about preparedness. I mean, if you look at these countries, South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Japan, they all had experience with this sort of viral outbreak before, and both the citizens and the government knew about it, and that really shows in their impressive reaction. When you look at US and China, it's very different. I mean, the US government, I mean, the White House had basically appointed, I don't know if you all saw this, but like essentially one of the cabinet level people who was responsible for our reaction early in January and February, you know, he appointed someone who had spent the last 6 years raising labradoodles to be our country's frontline response to this disease. And I think that is reflected in the disaster that followed, right? So but that's not something we could have avoided that. Like we could have elected, there could have been elected officials that had just reacted better. In fact, there are numerous democracies that have shown that like elected accountable officials can learn from the past and then act accordingly. So we saw one model of incompetence on the US side. On the China side, the Chinese Communist Party also knew, like just as much as Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, that this could happen. And in fact, they observed it first. But instead of telling the world about what was happening and giving the doctors what they needed to fix the thing and bringing, for example, these doctors who ended up getting arrested and censored to Beijing to have a sit down with Xi Jinping to figure out what do we do? How do we stop it? Instead, they decided to censor that information, try to cover up the outbreak for economic reasons. So, you've seen two different kinds of incompetence here, and both need to be avoided. I think that just, look, we're going to have more experience from this thing moving forward, and hopefully we can follow the direction of some of those East Asian democracies.
So one thing I would add is that I think it's easy to put too much blame on President Trump, the administration, and the incompetence there. And I think there was a lot. But I think the reality is many Western European liberal democracies suffered similar problems. And I think one common thread across all the countries that have really been hit hard by this, in my mind, is not that they have a current sort of irresponsible populist leader, but that they have irresponsible populist politics floating around, whether or not they have Macron at the moment or Le Pen at the moment or Johnson at the moment or whoever else. And I think what to me that's really a symptom of is that there's a fundamental disconnect in societies like the United States between technocrats, academics, intellectual leaders on the one hand, and sort of the integrative work that politics has to do on the other hand. This is something we really saw in spades during the Harvard process, where we really felt that the CDC and many of the technocrats were at least as much of the problem as were the administration. And the problem was there just wasn't the communication occurring. There wasn't the trust between the two sides. There was all sorts of things that were being said and analyzed by the technocrats that they were doing not because they thought that was the right strategic path to be on, but because they thought that in this environment it was the only thing that could work with the administration. And then the administration would do ill-judged things because they weren't getting the right information from the other side. And these two things spiraled with each other. So it was really the lack of sort of integration of all those different forms of expertise and communication across them that led to the systemic failure, rather than just any one individual element being primarily at fault or not listening to the experts enough, et cetera. And I think it's that problem of communication integration and overcoming sort of the technocratic populist divide in our societies that is what desperately needs to be addressed, rather than simply, quote, listening to the experts or something like that.
All right, thank you. I think we're going to move to participant questions, and we had one here from David. I'm going to unmute you.
Okay. Let's see. I just asked another question or made another comment as you were asking, but I guess exactly in sync with what was just said. There are communities of unreason. I actually call them death cults because of the demonstration over time that they truly mean for nothing other than holding power. And they are sources of noise, confusion, fear, and doubt. They are classic targets in Cold War contexts for a foreign power to stir up. And I wonder what social structures are more able to limit the growth and use of power by those groups, specifically to disrupt responses in emergencies. There is a tradition of Soviet, when Soviet Union existed, stirring up confusion about medical issues. Like the AIDS thing was only one. There's a story about how they promoted false narratives about HIV's causes. And I knew lots of educated intelligentsia people who gave credence to that. Like there was enough additional noise and crap that they were confused. it seems that a lot of these groovy, multi-level, organic, liberal processes depend on some common standards and norms. But if those are under active attack, either by a community of unreason that's endogenous or one that is stirred up from another adversary, it's very hard to make resilient structures against that. So I thought Glen and Alex had slightly different takes, and I want to drive a wedge. See what.
Okay, I'm going to unmute you two. Also, on that, we're going to have a salon tomorrow where we're going to talk more about general sense-making systems and how we can maybe use more predictive engines to get it right and incentivize evidence-based policy making. But Glen, you're unmuted. Alex, I'll do the same for you.
Glen, do you want to go?
Well, I would just say, I mean, look, Taiwan has also been the most successful country in the world at combating disinformation. And I don't think it's surprising that that's the case. I think the most effective systems for dealing with problems of disinformation are thoughtfully designed ones that rely on mechanisms of community trust and community engagement, but allow those to scale in ways that aren't perverse, basically. And I think, Taiwan has done a really effective job at carefully integrating those, as well as having at the highest level important checks. And many of the other liberal democracies have not. And so that put them in a situation that was an important threat to their ability to quickly coordinate on the solutions that they needed to coordinate on.
Yeah, and we can keep celebrating Taiwan, and we should. And it highlights the just corruption at the World Health Organization. I mean, this is an organization that won't even let Taiwan in. They were early on this. They've done an amazing job. They've done a job that is built on transparency and collaboration with its citizens. And they're not allowed in. And right now you're watching in the last 24 hours, China mounts a campaign where they're threatening like a bully other governments for basically saying we should let Taiwan in. So today, the Chinese Communist Party attacked New Zealand, basically saying, no, shut up, basically. So they're on this campaign to get other people to continue to prevent the best performing country in the world from entering the World Health Organization, which, by the way, is run by a guy who used to work for the regime of Meles Zenawi and who covered up numerous cholera outbreaks and presided over a huge massacre. So, I mean, the whole World Health Organization is symptomatic of why people have this distrust. And you've got the CEO of YouTube on TV 3 weeks ago saying that anything that doesn't comply, essentially, with World Health Organization recommendations is going to get taken off of YouTube. So a lot of people are being forced to think for themselves because the CDC is off the ball, spreading misinformation, lagging behind. The World Health Organization is completely lost its credibility. Who's left? So it's like local experts, local hospitals, your local communities. I mean, I don't know what you both have to say about this, but it's really disheartening to see these big global organizations fail so miserably.
Zarinah, do you want to chime in?
No,
okay.
Yeah.
Then we take Rachel's question. Okay, Rachel, you go.
Okay, great. So it was a little faster than I expected. So Zarinah, I was hoping we could borrow from your imagination a little bit in visioning a better future. And of course, as Zarinah knows, I have a lot of respect for her thinking and activism in this space. And so, I'm thinking of that meme that you posted, right? Zarinah had posted this wonderful meme that said, suddenly it's easier to imagine the end of capitalism than the end of the world, which I think really hit a nerve for me and hit a nerve that a lot of people are feeling, because it felt very true. I couldn't imagine the end of capitalism very well before, and suddenly it is possible. So that's a long-winded way of asking, could you share a narrative or a vision with us of what that transition might look like in its ideal form, and what it would look like on the other side, so we can sort of imagine what that more positive future might look like?
Mm-hmm, yeah, that's my first meme that I ever made, by the way.
It was excellent.
So this meme came from Mark Fisher's Capitalist Realism. The original quote is, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism, and that we're really sort of stuck in this failure to imagine, despite the fact that we've lived in many other systems and we inevitably are going to live in other ones. It's very unlikely, statistically speaking, that we're just going to remain in this moment. But nonetheless, most people just find it really hard to imagine. They sort of equate capitalist forces or whatever they mean by that with sort of versions of human nature. And suddenly here we are, like the economy stopped, and we're all like, oh wow, it's like in many ways it's okay, in many ways our lives are better. Oh my God, like what else could we imagine coming from this? And I think there is a sort of very wonderful sort of flourishing set of paths out of this. So I think Michelle Bowen's talked a lot about sort of modes of societal transformation and different economy formations. And there's various theories about how these things change. One idea is that we sort of have these stable moments that are sort of disrupted by a sort of outward chaotic event that leads us into the next system. So an example of that is the mercantile system, which was disrupted by the French Revolution and then took us into Adam Smith's sort of capitalist system, which stayed stable for a long time. Then we had World War I and II, which was the external disruption, and out of that came sort of the welfare state. And whether or not you agree with these theories, there are these sort of like ideas that like different forms of resource allocation exist in different sort of like distributions across sort of space and time in the world, and they sort of tend to dominate in different ways, but they do transition, right? We've seen this happen many times, and they are going to transition again. And Michelle Bowen would have you believe that there are sort of seed forms that are embedded, and that's how we sort of like blossom into our next system. And so their theory is that we've been in this state of crisis since 2008 crisis. We've been in a state of chaos since then. And in 2008, when everything crashed, we didn't know what to do. We didn't have any alternatives. It was the case that there was no alternative. God, I never thought I'd make that quote. But it's been a decade since then, and we've all been exploring tons of different things. There are extraordinary examples all over the world of solidarity economies, commons economies, radical exchange markets, like all these extraordinary things that are happening all over the place. If you sort of add them up, they sort of equate to a new society right under our feet. It's just that we haven't quite sort of gotten to the sort of point of being collaborative about how these work, which is sort of concept of dual power, if anyone wants to go and read about it. And so I would argue that there are tons of diverse economies, social experiments, prototype societies right under our feet. And what we need to do is lean into that and not be afraid and not be like, oh God, how do we fix this terrible, blistering sort of cold sore that is the now? But rather be like, hey, like, who do we want to be as a species? Let's like explore that. Let's like do that together. How do we make sure that different kinds of people are represented in those experiments? How do we make sure that we can share learnings and sort of walk into that future together? And that for me feels really exciting.
Well, I think it's exciting in the sense that I think what the Embassy Network is doing, right? Like it's really kind of like creating little pockets in which you can prototype like really different ways in which to engage. Like, and it almost feels like, that like that dream of doing that somewhere else, like if it's on the water for sea setting or something, like it feels like we are doing that to some extent on a daily basis by doing things quite differently and experimenting with a lot of things and actually taking stock. But I would love to have also Alex and Glen chime in, because it really ties in nicely with the last question that I planned to ask, which is if we get it right, how do you think we could be cooperating in, let's say, like maybe 2 or 3 years from now? And what are specific experiments right now that you want to draw people's attention to? Where should they lean into if they want to explore alternative ways of cooperating right now? I'm muting both of you. Yes.
Go ahead, Alex.
Okay, so there's a guy who runs a pretty popular kind of financial blog. His name's Ben Hunt, and his platform is called Epsilon Theory. Some of you may know of it. And he has like a rallying cry. It's basically burn it the F down. And he's basically attacking and criticizing the model by which we've been locked in since 2007-8, whereby essentially a lot of the bad actors who helped collapse our collective economies kind of got off the hook. Very few of them went to prison, if any. They all ended up better than before. And essentially this process by which people get bailed out of making bad, really large decisions just kind of gets continued because they are closer to the sort of policy circle that decides when to print more money and where it goes. This is called like the Cantillon effect, named after Richard Cantillon, an 18th century economist. And it continues to this day. So he's kind of like rallying against that. And I think that's a very important mind frame and perspective to take, that the current system, call it whatever you want to call it, obviously is hopelessly corrupt and detached. I mean, how can you have the stock market at all-time highs when there's tens of millions of Americans who are unemployed? This is eventually going to show in the data and the numbers, but right now it's just such a gross kind of incompatibility, right? And I think one aspect of that is thinking about different models of doing things, right? So I think that's why there's just this interest in, at least the Bitcoin community, in, you know, experimenting with a different economic model that's not controlled by a small group of elites, that's basically owned by the people, that everybody controls and that no one in particular is in charge of. So that's certainly an economic model that I'm looking very carefully at, and people around the world, especially living under dictatorships and authoritarian regimes, are flocking to this in sort of record numbers if you look at the data. So that's interesting to me.
Okay, I'm posting the book here that you wrote on this. It's really nice. I strongly recommend people checking it out. It picks people up, I think, but goes into really specific details. Glenn.
You know, this is RadicalXChange's bread and butter. We try to build experiments on these types of things and to lift up examples like Taiwan, where these things are in various ways already starting to have success. I think that, to me, the most important aspect is storytelling. The story of Taiwan is not being told in the way the story of China is being told. And I think one of the most powerful things all of us can do is bring that vividly home to people, make people realize that it is not primarily the quote, organized authoritarian societies that are most succeeding at addressing our most critical, problems, and that there aren't just the choice between sort of the populisms of the left and the right, but there really are workable models out there that are really making differences in people's lives, that are addressing our problems, and give people the optimism to really go in a more positive direction.
Yeah, thanks. I posted a link to the chapters, the RadicalXChange chapters, I think, on here. I went through a little bit there, and it was it's actually really nicely done, man. You give even local, people who are interested in leading a local chapter on those concepts, you give them a kind of run-up guide of how they may want to structure their first meetings and stuff. I thought I think it's really nice to see when people are forming around certain ideals and then they're practicing those ideals in the way that they are coordinating around those. So I think it's a really amazing communities to check out, and you can do so on that website. And maybe if you want to kind of leave participants, because we're now 1 minute over time, in one sentence only, what should people do right now? Where do you want to kind of where would you like people to go out to after this? And yeah. How would you like to close this out on your end?
Any order? Nope.
Any order you like.
I think I would say, there's that great quote, we cannot create what we cannot imagine. And I think we need to imagine better. And so my ask is that you all go away and think deeply about what you want the future of humanity to look like, and forget everything that you think is possible and everything that you've been told is possible, and just let your imagination go and then think about how to get there.
Yeah, I'll riff on Zarinah. There's a thin line between imagination and reality, and it's called leadership. And I hope that all of us can be leaders and walk that thin line.
I'll certainly echo what Glenn said about trying to look more closely at Taiwan and help Taiwan tell its story. I think that's going to be incredibly important as we move forward. And just end with a quote from a friend who said, basically, specifically with regard to what's happening in the economy, if you're not radicalized, you're not paying attention.
All right, great. I'm posting a lot of the links in which people can follow up with that work specifically here. I thought that was actually quite actionable. We've tried to do somewhat of that kind of framing with a Dr. Lee celebration day, basically celebrating the whistleblower, Dr. Lee. We had a salon on that and how to set up a global event for that. I encourage you to check it out as well. I think definitely kind of narrative shaping now is a really good time to do that. And yeah, thank you so much for joining. I think we covered a host of different topics. Thank you so much for staying 3 minutes over time. I want to kind of like wave goodbye to you all. For those who are interested in staying, Lou will take over now with like some kind of like participant sharing. So you're welcome to stay on, but I want to be mindful of your time. I can't thank you enough. I feel almost bad for having plugged you from your various different efforts right now and actually making those futures happen. But I really admire that you came on and shared this, and I'm hoping that participants get involved in those efforts. Thank you so much. I hope you all have a really lovely day.